What's up? Welcome to Bookstr Business, sponsored by Jen of KD and Bookstr. I'm here with my guest of the day, Alan Gannett. How are you?
Thanks for having me. I'm great.
You're always great.
I'm always great. Life is great.
Life is great.
It's pub week. Stuff's happening.
You wrote this book, The Creative Curve.
It's all happening.
Yeah. Tell us about The Creative Curve.
So the book is all about this idea of whether or not you can actually learn to be more creative. You know, we talk about creativity as this thing that's like magical. Some people have it, some people don't.
Kind of comes out of the air.
Yeah, it's just like it hits you in these lightning bolt moments. And so the book's broken into two halves. The first half of the book is sort of like a Mythbusters around creativity and creativity thought. And the second half is I interviewed about 25 living creative giants. So like Ted Sarandos, the chief content officer of Netflix, Christian Ashley, the best-selling romance novelist, Pasek and Paul, the songwriting duo who did La La Land, Dear Evan Hansen, and The Greatest Showman. And I explained, like, what are the patterns that they actually do to enhance their creativity?
You missed Alexis Ohanian, who's the founder of Reddit, and Serena Williams' husband.
Yes, Serena, fun fact.
Yeah. Now he's famous for being Serena's.
Yeah, it's good. Now he's in tabloids.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's what happens.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's how you know you made it, when you see yourself on page 6.
Yeah.
So anyway, creativity is something that can be learned. How?
So one of the things when we think about creativity is that it happens in here. And we're actually pretty bad at like realizing how adaptable our brains are. So like we would all agree that if I started going to the gym and ate a lot of protein, like I would gain more muscle.
Depends on your body type.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But when we think about creativity and we think about our brains, we sort of go, oh, well, you have these fixed assets.
Sure.
But it's actually not true. So it turns out when you actually do studies, what you find is that actually IQ and creative potential are not related. Once you get to an IQ of 104, there's no correlation between IQ and creativity. There's a famous study that was done where they actually looked and they found that kindergartners, 86% tested at creative genius levels of creative potential, but by the time they were in high school, it was 15%. And so what you find is that we all have this creative potential, but something happens. Like something happens in our society where by the time we're 18, we don't think we can actually do it.
They kind of just,
Yeah, you're going to be an accountant.
Yeah.
You know
Sounds
it.
really boring.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But some people like being accountants.
That's okay. They should be an accountant then.
Yeah. But what if you don't want to be an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor or anything like that? Like, for instance, what are you?
So I run a company called TrackMaven. It's a marketing analytics platform that works with a lot of big brands to help them find what are the patterns in their marketing data. So what drives consumer taste, what drives preference, what do people like and not like, and that's what we're really focused on doing. But what I think is really interesting is when you actually look at creativity, one of the things you find is that we actually know a lot about what drives human preference. So we think about, okay, well, like, what do people like or what do people not like? Like, that's such a, trends, hits, they're so hard.
Cheeseburgers, baseball.
Yeah, cheeseburgers,
oh, wait,
baseball.
that's Missouri.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's what my cousins like in Missouri. Here we like falafel and soccer.
Yeah, and sushi burritos.
Yeah, there you go.
And so what you find, and one of the things I talk about in the book, is that there's actually this relationship between familiarity and novelty that drives a lot of human preference. So it's not just about creating something new, but it actually turns out that the best creative ideas are one that blend the familiar and the novel. Think about the first Star Wars as a Western in space.
Right, yeah.
Right? Think about how much of music is remixes or samples. The best creative ideas really bring the two together.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So everything's kind of retro.
Everything's kind of retro, everything's kind of nostalgia, and the best creators are actually very comfortable with this idea that their job isn't actually to be purely new, but it's actually to take things that people are comfortable with and like remix them in interesting ways to change it. So you see this with a lot of novelists where most novels follow the same 4 basic story arcs. They're not reinventing how you tell a story. So there's Man in a Hole, Cinderella Man, Boy Meets Girl, and then a Kafka story. Kafka story is a saddest. It starts here and it gets sadder and sadder and sadder. And
that
so
sounds like the type of book I would have
Yeah,
read.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so what you find is that over and over again, people use the same way of telling a story, but it's how they introduce the characters, it's how they play with the ideas, the plots, the twists. That's what really is the creative part.
I believe South Park did a thing that said I member. The little member
I'm not
bears.
hip enough to watch South Park.
Well, anyway, they had this thing called these little anthropomorphic grapes that would remember things.
Okay.
They'd be like, member Reagan, I remember. So basically everything, since everything is retro and we recreate everything, it's all about jogging our memories of the past.
And it's even in really small examples. So I talk in the book about hit doctors and songwriters. And one of the things you see that's really interesting is that songwriters, one of the things they do when they write a pop song is there's this whole sort of mafia of Swedish songwriters that's led by this guy, Max Martin.
He wrote all of Britney stuff and NSYNC stuff.
Justin Timberlake, all these guys
Yeah.
and women. And one of the things so interesting is he has the third most #1 singles after Paul McCartney and John Lennon. And one of his big techniques that really drives a lot of the intrigue of his songs is he takes part of the chorus and he introduces it very early, like in the first verse or in the intro. So by the time it comes to the chorus, you've already heard it before. Like it's already kind of in your head. It's already captured.
That earworm.
Yeah,
embeds,
exactly. You know,
yeah.
T Swift.
The T Swift. So you interviewed a lot of heavy hitters. I see this list here, and it's kind of mind-boggling how you got in touch with all these people. I mean, it's kind of, I would call it a list of the biggest people you've never heard of for a general
Totally,
audience. Yeah. But I mean, the founder of Reddit is someone recognizable. Andrew Ross Sorkin, a very familiar face for old people who watch CNBC. You know, your creative
New
guys.
Yorkers.
Yeah, exactly. New Yorkers, etc. What was the common thread that all these people had?
So what I was looking for in the interviews was I was looking for people who showed that they were able to be creative across fields and across projects. So it wasn't that they were one-hit wonders, right? The subtitle of the book is How to Develop the Right Idea at the Right Time. And I think that timing is such a huge part of creativity. You know, we so often think that creativity is one of these things that, you know, is magical. But what you find
The
is
muses inspire you.
The muses inspire you, right? But you find that there's some people who are over and over again, they're able to create these hit ideas. And so that's what's really fascinating to me. Is like, how do you create, like, Kevin Ryan is an entrepreneur here in New York, and he did Guilt, MongoDB, Business Insider, DoubleClick, and he has a whole bunch of other ones that are now still going that are doing really well. And like, how do you do that? Like, how
So this one Swedish guy wrote all these songs.
this one CEO, yeah,
Started teen brands.
yeah, and that's what's so fascinating to me is how do these people do that? There must be something more at work, right, than luck.
Well, evidently, I am channeled into the zeitgeist because that was our first audience question. What do they have similarities between the creative process in different fields? I guess it's a slightly different question.
So the second half of the book is these 4 patterns I found, and the one that I think is probably the most surprising to me is that we talk about creatives almost in opposition to consumers. And there's this social media meme, you might have seen it, that's like really terrible, that 90% of people consume, 9% engage, 1% create, #hustle. And it's like terrible.
Sounds like a Mitt Romney talking
Yeah, exactly,
point. It sounds
yeah.
like a politician's talking about there's givers and takers, right?
But the thing is, it's also not true. One of the things I found is that these really successful creatives are also some of the biggest consumers in their niche.
Of course.
And it's not that they're very wide in their consumption. They actually go very, very deep. They know a lot about a little, not a little about a lot like a lot of us. And that is so important because since familiarity is part of creativity, since creating something that is a remix, is nostalgic, all these things, you have to know what's already out there. So in the book, I talk about this finding I found where these creatives spend on average, even they're very successful, about 20% of their time consuming. So I call it the 20% principle. And it's the idea that these creatives over and over again, I heard this pattern where they'd spend 3 to 4 hours of their day, 20% of their waking hours, consuming content. That's a lot of consumption.
I do that easily.
But for them, that's a huge part of why they feel they're successful.
No, I feel like it's something that you have to constantly keep up
Yeah.
with, even as a journalist and someone who interviews people for a living, just to get all your references,
And
just
to
to
be
be
in the
able.
know.
I mean, his PR list. If you look at what the PR person provided, it was like a who's who in business leaders. And the only reason I know all of these names is because I spend 4 hours a day reading.
Yeah.
Because there's
That's
no
why you're a
other
business
way.
journalist.
Yeah, absolutely. Even someone, you know, for the foodies out there, Jose Andres.
Yes, love
Someone
him.
who's, you know,
Just got
fed,
his first Michelin star.
got his first Michelin star,
Yeah.
fed millions of meals in Puerto Rico, and you know, Spanish entrepreneur, creating a restaurant right down the street from me,
Oh,
kind of
cool.
like Italy,
You
but
should go.
but of Spain.
I
You know,
love it.
Spanish eating marketplace.
I love it.
What'd you learn from Jose Andres?
So Jose and I, he lives in DC, where I'm from, and so
I've been to his restaurants. Good.
And I went to go interview him, and he was like, "Come interview me at my house." I'm like, "Okay." And so I show up at this, you know, world famous chef's house at 9 a.m. It's like the super modern house.
Did you get breakfast?
And his assistant, it gets worse. So his assistant lets me in, and I start hearing creaks up on the second floor. I'm like, oh my God, I just woke up Jose Andres. Like, he literally, like, and so he comes down, and he, like, clearly, like, has, like, I've woken him up, and I'm like, I'm feeling terrible. And he's like, do you want coffee? And I'm like, no. And he starts making the most exacting coffee of all time. Like, I've never seen someone grind the beans, measure it.
He did it?
Oh, he was like,
His assistant didn't do
No,
it?
he was doing this. And what's so interesting talking to him is that you think of chefs as these very sort of organic people, like they're playing with food, it's very romantic. But like he told me that like he goes every year to all these food conferences to see like what are the newest ingredients, techniques. He has a garden where he's constantly planting new things to see, what are different flavors that he could play with. And so again, this idea of consumption and ingestion is actually really important. And Jose Andres has a food group called Think Food Group, which runs all their restaurants. And I went to their office, and they have this whole innovation process around trying new recipes, around introducing new ideas into their menus. And this thing which you might think is, oh, this is very like nebulous, is actually a very structured, thoughtful process.
Okay, so speaking of structured and formulaic stuff, I've seen book learn creativity seems like creativity, but really they are following formulas. Do you feel there's a difference between authentic and natural creativity and learned creativity?
Great question. So when we talk about creativity, academics talk about two types. There's little c creativity, which is basically just creating something new, like the physical act of creating. Then there's uppercase C creativity, which is creating something that's both new and valuable.
Okay.
And that's what most of us want to aspire to. When we create a song, we write a book, we want people to actually acknowledge it, read it, enjoy it, find pleasure in it.
Of course.
And one of the things that's so interesting is that you find that these really great creators are actually much more comfortable often than aspiring creators with this idea that they're creating for the audience.
Of course.
I think a lot of aspiring creators are saying, oh, I'm creating for myself. It's something I enjoy, that I'm passionate about. But you find these great creators are actually very comfortable to
So they know their audience.
They know their audience, and they're comfortable with the commercial and the PR aspects of it. They might not do it themselves. Like a lot of them feel like they're not good at it, so they have a collaborator or a partner or someone who helps them with it. But they realize that part of creativity is distribution. It is recognition.
Absolutely. So this is a website about books. You know, these are book enthusiasts. So
Love
of course
it.
we got this type of question. Did you read many books in this genre in order to write your own book?
I read lots of books. I read lots and lots of peer-reviewed research. I had a sort of an interesting moment where I realized about halfway in when I was writing the chapter on consumption, I was like, oh my God, I consumed so much. And one of the interesting things about
Hopefully not too much on Saturday
hopefully
night.
not too much. Yeah, exactly. One of the things about consumption that's so interesting is that when we talk about creativity, these aha moments, these flashes of inspiration as this magical thing. But I explained in the book that we actually have a lot of science about how these aha moments happen. So basically, your brain has two different forms of processing. Your left hemisphere is where you do very logical, rational processing. So like step by step, it's where you do a math problem. It's if you're solving a crossword puzzle, you're like, okay, it's G.
I don't do those.
It's R, Sudoku, whatever it is. And
Sudoku.
Yeah, you know.
There we go.
But it's very conscious. Your right hemisphere is where you do creative thinking. It's where you do divergent thinking. And that type of processing, connecting distant concepts together, is all subconscious. And it's only once the answer comes that it pops into consciousness. And that's the aha. But what's interesting about these...
So it's in there.
It's in there. But what's interesting about this is that, A, it's a normal biological process. Like we put people in MRI machines and we've observed this happening.
Sure.
But what's also interesting about this is it's kind of like you have a loud lab partner and a quiet lab partner. Okay. Like your left hemisphere is like, let's go through all these steps. Like it's your bro-y, obnoxious, like college lab
It's a frat
partner.
boy on this side.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Your right hemisphere is the quiet, like talks very quietly. And so
librarian.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you can only hear your right hemisphere when your left hemisphere is quiet. This is why people experience aha moments in the shower, on a run, on a commute. It's not that your commute is inspiring, no offense, but like it's that you actually can hear what's going on in your right hemisphere. And consumption is so important to this because if you want to have these right hemisphere moments, these right hemisphere ideas, yeah, you have to have quiet time, but you also have to have the dots to connect. You have the electricity for the light bulb moments. If you haven't consumed, you have nothing for actually combined together.
Absolutely, it's the integration. So we're going to name drop a little bit. What companies stand out to you? That's what the audience wants to know. And how much does it depend on their audience or consumer?
So I spent a day with the Ben & Jerry's flavor team.
Okay, that was another question.
Oh my gosh.
How was it working with Ben & Jerry's flavor team?
It was so fun.
You gained a bunch of weight.
I was going to say, I said, well, two things. One, I'm not very tolerant of milk, so that was interesting. And then two, also they're all skinny. all the flavor team, and I was like, how does this happen? Like, there's some conspiracy going on, I think. But one of the things that's so interesting is that Ben and Jerry's, we think of again as this like, they're like creating these fun, zany flavors,
right.
but it's actually very data-driven. So like every year, the flavor team spends about a year consuming, sometimes literally, trends about food. So like they go on trips to different cities, they try local restaurants, bars.
Interesting.
Yeah, they call them trend treks.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, it sounds great, right? And then they come up with this from a list of 200 different flavor ideas. And they don't go into the kitchen. They don't start making them. What they do is they literally send an email survey that asks their customers 2 questions. 1, how likely are you to buy this flavor? And 2, how unique is it? And this is basically asking how familiar is it and how novel is it? Because if it was just how likely are you to buy, well then you'd end up with all salted caramel brownie, cookie crunch flavors.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah, it sounds not bad. But having an entire line of that would quickly get stale. And so what they've realized is that they have to add structure to their innovation process to elegantly balance this relationship between familiarity and novelty. And by the way, they now have almond milk ice cream, which is amazing.
I feel like, and I have a lot of authors on my payroll over at Gen FKD, it's because I hire writers and video
It's a
people.
humble brag, it's fine.
Right. No. But they all don't think of their creative process like this. I feel like I'm going to hand this book to my head writer and be like, what you've told me is complete garbage.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, but J.K. Rowling's a great example of this, where, obviously huge culture changer, but she went to this interview and she showed the interviewer the box of all 15 versions of the first chapter of book 1 of Harry Potter.
15?
15. And we talk about J.K. Rowling as this person who was like struck with this lightning bolt idea of Harry Potter on a train. But the reality is that she took 5 years to write the first book. 5 years. And so often these stories that we've internalized about creativity as this momentary thing that overwhelms us is really just that. It's a story. It's not reality.
So, Shonda asks about the difference between the big C and the little c when it comes to creativity. Is one more profitable than the other?
Yes. So, little c creativity, I think, is something that we can often get sort of confused on because I, for example, could do little c creativity and I could throw a bunch of paint on a canvas, but it's not big C creativity. It's not the next Jackson Pollock. People would say, why did he do that? Why did he waste the paint? And so I think it's really important that when you want to create things, to be aware of the fact that there is this entire social phenomenon to creativity. You need recognition. You need awareness. This is why, for example, if you want to become a great artist or screenwriter, like artists move to New York, screenwriter move to LA, maybe New York, right? This is actually really important, the social side of it. And you see that the most successful creatives, like look at Andy Warhol, huge social animal. He literally built the factory in New York, which had all of his assistants, his friends, all these people around him. And he built this creative community around him. And so you find that even though our sort of mythology of creators is those of the solo genius, the reality is that they're all part of these creative communities. A lot of YouTubers actually live in the same building in LA. There's this one apartment building, they're all like rented apartments. Because there's something about that social dynamic which is actually inherent to successful creativity.
Oh, wow. So working remotely isn't too great.
No, it's hard.
Yeah. Absolutely. So tell us, how long did it take you to write the book? Everyone in this audience is always very curious,
But the book
how
process?
did it come about? Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
So I'm a stubborn kid from New Jersey originally, and I was getting really frustrated with, work with a lot of marketers, and I'd hear them say something like, well, I'm just not that creative. And the thing that sort of annoys me more than anything in the world is people limiting themselves. And I'd read a lot of books on creativity. I'd read some of the autobiographies of creatives. I knew that we know that creativity is learnable. Like there's actually been science about this for the last 30 years. But I realized that I was actually in the minority. Most people have this notion, this inspiration theory of creativity that's just...
I don't think I'm very creative. You're changing my mind. But
and it's just like scientifically invalid. Like we actually know that he's creative. We know that creativity is nurturable.
I think of creativity like the ability to draw or paint. Are you good at that?
No, but that's a technical skill. Like you could get good at that.
No.
Yes, you could. So here's my challenge for you. If you don't think that you can get better at something like drawing or painting or singing, let's say, that's one that always people bring up, I want you to go on YouTube and I want you to search before and after voice lesson videos. This is like a whole subgenre on YouTube of people who are like 1 year later.
YouTube is just a pit of time.
But it's like people become amazing. Like one of the things I always hear is people are like, oh, well, like I could become a great dancer. And I'm like, have you ever taken a dance lesson? They're like, well, no. It's like, Well, why not? They're like, well, I'd be bad at it. Everyone's bad at it to start. Mozart's this famous example where we talk about him as this child prodigy, but like, that's complete BS. Like, here's the real Mozart story. If you ever watch Amadeus, he's like, oh, he wrote an opera at 4 or 6 or something. The real Mozart story is he basically had a helicopter dad who was rich and hired for him the best music teachers in all of Europe when he was 3 and made him practice 3 hours every single day his entire childhood. He wrote his first truly original piece of music when he was 17. Okay. That's after 14 years
That's more reasonable.
of practicing 3 hours every single day with the best music teachers in all of Europe under the conditional love of a helicopter dad.
Well, you talk about in the book Malcolm Gladwell's rule. Can you tell us a little bit about that for people who aren't familiar?
So Malcolm Gladwell has this notion in the book Outliers of the 10,000 hour rule, which has sort of really permeated a lot of sort of business culture. This idea that with 10,000 hours of practice, you can become world class at anything. And it's interesting because he sort of has the right frame of mind about it. Like, it is true that you can develop talent in anything. Like, we have a lot of science about that. But he butchers the execution. So this 10,000 hour rule is based on research by K. Anders Ericsson, who's a famous professor of talent development. And I interviewed him for my book, and the quote he gave me, which I put in the book, is that Gladwell misread my paper, period. And fire. Wow. Clap back. And the thing is that he made 2 big mistakes. One is that 10,000 hours was the average across people and across skills. So some people take a little bit more, some people take a little bit less. But more importantly, skills vary widely. To become the world's best piano player takes about 25,000 hours because people have been doing it for so long. There's so many people. People start when they were 3. But
certain skills not a lot of people do.
Digit memorization is this new thing. There's tournaments for how many digits of pi you can memorize. It takes only about 400 hours to become the world's best digit memorizer right now. But that will keep going up. So that's the first big mistake. The second big mistake is actually bigger. Anders Ericsson's research is all about something called deliberate practice, not just practice. And they're actually very different. Deliberate practice is the idea of taking a big skill and breaking it down into a micro skill. It's the difference between saying, I'm going to practice driving, I'm going to drive home, versus I'm going to practice high-speed left turns. One will make you into a NASCAR driver, one will just make your commute more subconscious, right? And so we often, when we talk about practice, what we don't realize is that we're just building our rote memory. And so if you want to keep excelling, what you see the world-class talents do is they break down these skills into tiny things. Like fine art painters will practice brush pressure, where they'll draw one stroke and then try and replicate that stroke exactly to practice their brush pressure. It's not just about, oh, I'm going to recreate the Mona Lisa, right? And so that's actually very, very important. So Malcolm Gladwell just like gets it wrong.
He's gotten a lot of hell about a lot of his stuff, including football. He recommends kids don't play football and hockey and all that stuff. So it's not the first time Malcolm Gladwell has messed up. You have a tsunami of questions. I've never seen this many questions.
Great, we love questions.
Okay, so let me pick a question. I like this one. I like these two. So you're Forbes under 30, blah, blah, blah. You're on the list. You're successful. You have successful. You're a prodigy. You're a Mozart in the making digitally. What do you plan on doing next?
I've figured out with my life that I'm much happier when I focus on the journey. And so I think I used to be very focused on like specific goals. Like I was an overachiever. I started my first company when I was 16. Like I was always sort of like, what's that next checkbox I want to do? And what I found is that when you get to those checkboxes, it doesn't actually make you happy. And so right now, for example, I'm the happiest I've ever been. That's because, you know, my company, I have an amazing team. I have really good people around me. I have great customers, investors, board members.
Based in D.C.,
Based in Washington, D.C. And so for me, it's like I could do this for 30 more years if it keeps being this fun, if the journey keeps being this fun. And so I've stopped being very goal-oriented.
Well, that's actually very interesting advice. Yeah. And that leads to the next question. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received? Is it related to that?
Yeah, this is the best piece of advice I ever received. Is something that, ironically, I didn't take to heart, which is that the best practices are the best practices for a reason. One thing I think, especially when you're a younger entrepreneur or creative or writer, whatever it is like the people who tend to do these things younger kind of are know-it-alls, and myself not excluded. And so I think, especially when I was like 20 or 21, like I would get this advice, and I was like, I got this. Like, yeah, thank you. But what you find is that actually oftentimes reinventing the wheel isn't the best thing to do. And actually looking backwards at what people have done before, what's been proven, that is actually really, really important. So that's advice I wish I listened to more, but now I try and listen to.
So our last question, Shoshi, is a really good question. This would be one of my questions.
Okay, good.
Okay?
It's like 60 minutes now.
So, yeah, no, absolutely. What is your approach to writing a raw idea and beginning to develop it? And most importantly, how do you know it's good? Because all this stuff about creativity gets you high on, oh, I'm a creative, my next idea is wonderful.
So here's something that I think is really, really important. And you'll hear writers talk about this, and I think it's easy to let this kind of go in one ear, out the other. But I really do think all writing is rewriting. Like, this book has probably gone through 1,000 iterations between every time you write a chapter, you edit it, you throw it all out, you edit it again. And I think what you find when you actually talk to creatives is that process of getting feedback, internalizing it, editing it, doing it over and over again, you find is common across all fields. Like movies, for example, do all these test screenings. You know, for the book, for example, I had all these feedback readers. I had about 15 friends who I had reading it who were part of the target demographic. And so as I was writing it, I was sending it. And like, what's really interesting is that feedback, once you realize how effective it is and making you better, it actually starts to become addicting. Where like, when people would give me like overly positive feedback, I'd be like annoyed. I'm like, no, I want to know what you don't like so I can fix it. Like, that's the point of this. And so what you have to remember is that if the relationship in creativity is with the audience, if it's about creating something the audience wants, then you better listen to them early and often.
It's almost like vote early and often.
Oh my
being
God.
from DC.
There you go, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's your advice for anyone who wants to write a book?
I think if you want to write a book, I think it depends if it's fiction or nonfiction. If it's fiction, I think become part of a writer community, start learning that way, start getting that feedback. I think that's really important. I think with nonfiction, it's very important to first build the platform. Like, I think I wouldn't have been able to do this if I didn't already have a company, if I didn't already have some of those things in place.
Because that lends you credibility.
It lends you credibility for when you want to get interviews, when you want to get a publisher, you want to get all those things. So I think in fiction, you can really get across with just the quality of your work, just because that sort of segment's more used to that. I think with nonfiction these days, it's really important to first have built the platform.
Personality-driven nonfiction.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, anyway, thank you so much for joining
Thanks for having
us.
me, David.
It's been really nice. Join us soon for another episode of Bookstr Business. Thank you so much.